Hello and welcome to ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environmental, social and governance. I'm your host, Andie Wood. I'm filling in for Mandy McReynolds today. Regular listeners will have heard me before. I'm usually providing a European perspective alongside Steve Soter's fantastic SEC know-how. If you haven't heard me before, and as a first-time host as well, let me introduce myself. So I'm Andie Wood. I'm our Vice President of Regulatory Strategy at Workiva. I'm a lover of variety. I have spent my career across data, digitization, standard setting and technology, but all within that scope of corporate reporting and a very strong common thread of regulation in the regulatory world. If you are in the group who've listened to me before, you might be forgiven for thinking I only ever talk about the European Union and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, otherwise called the CSRD. That isn't quite true, and I will attempt to demonstrate that today, but also more on the CSRD in a moment. Before we really get into the CSRD, though, I wanted to take a broader look at the context that regulation sits in. A general principle for me that I bear in mind when I'm looking at a new regulation is that it never falls into an empty world or a vacuum. There's always something going on around it. There's the markets, there's what's happening internally within companies, and of course there are other regulations. And right now in the European Union, there is a lot going on. The other major theme, however, is sustainability. And you'll notice there, I didn't say ESG. What's the difference, I hear you ask? Well, it's not a universally agreed definition, but the way I tend to look at this is that ESG is a term that gives us a collection of topics that are increasingly important in business, and they're part of that broader picture of company performance and value, environmental topics, social topics, and of course, the governance of the organization. Sustainability is a bit of a broader term. It's about building a sustainable world and a sustainable company. It's fit for the longer term, and of course doing that needs a broad strategy and an understanding of impact, the impact the company wants to make on the world and the impact the world will have on the business. That impact might be financial, it might be related to communities, the natural world, the functioning of value chains, how well an organisation is governed. In short, the sustainability of a business is dependent on more than just the financial numbers, and the topics that broaden that we often refer to using that ESG shorthand form. Sustainability isn't just an important topic at the policy level, however. It has long been a consideration of investors, and the factors they take into account when looking at the value of an organisation have evolved to include data from across those ESG topics. And of course, we know that increasingly consumers and customers consider sustainability important, employees do as well, and of course, communities that the companies sit within. A final point, of course, is that reporting on sustainability and ESG topics isn't new, not even from a regulatory perspective. What is new is the focus on sustainability, not non-financial, and the robustness of the requirements. So, on that note, this is where I do talk about the CSRD. I expect by now, most of you will have at least heard of the CSRD, quite possibly from me. But what does it mean in practice? Well, in practice, it's a very broad directive. That is the type of regulatory requirement that this is. And it has a number of features that did not exist in the previous regulatory landscape for this kind of reporting within the EU. The major differences, I think, that have a particular impact on companies are that it's very prescriptive. It specifies a set of standards that will be used, and those standards are a new set of standards developed by the European Union specifically for this directive. They're called the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and I will come back to them a bit later. It's audited. One of the gaps that many identified with the existing requirements was that, certainly from the investor perspective, the sustainability information wasn't necessarily as verified or verifiable as they would like. So the Commission looked at that and has introduced an audit requirement. The audit starts off as something called limited audit, but there is a goal of moving towards reasonable assurance. And obviously, the idea that there will be this external set of eyes looking over this from an audit perspective is something that has quite a lot of companies paying a lot of attention. It's regulated information, so as well as those external auditors looking at this information, obviously it will become part of the information that the regulators review in detail when they receive their regulatory filings. And finally, I think one of the things that is embedded throughout and in general is talked about quite strongly by the policymakers is the aim to bring the sustainability information that companies are reporting to the same level as the financial information that companies report. And by level, we mean that same level of audit and verification. But we also mean things like aligning the sign-off. The same people who are currently signing off the financial statements are going to be the same people who will sign off the sustainability statements. And that, of course, means that we're talking about a concept that has existed for a while, but is now becoming much more formalized, which is the idea that this is integrated reporting. And by integrated reporting, we don't just mean that the content will sit together in a document, which is one of the requirements. The sign-off is also integrated, as I just mentioned. But we're now looking at this very much from the sustainability lens of an organization. So back to that definition that I used earlier, where sustainability encompasses all of what it is that makes an organization and a business model sustainable, whether that's financial information or sustainability information. So it's really about more than just disclosure. I think the final thing to note, something that I haven't really talked about yet, is who this affects. Now, if this directive was affecting maybe a few hundred public listed companies, maybe it would be a little less prominent than it is at the moment. But this directive very deliberately brings in a large scope of companies within the European Union. So for those of you in the European Union, you are probably already having discussions about whether you're in scope and also when you're in scope, because it has a phased introduction. But I think something that has been recently picked up on quite strongly, and other organisations are starting to notice, is that the way that it's been set up does mean that a significant number of non-European Union companies are affected in some way. Now, that might be an indirect effect. It might be because subsidiaries fall under the requirement. It might be because other listings fall under the requirement. Or it might be the most famous requirement of all, which is the extraterritoriality requirement, which brings a whole non-EU headquartered company in if it meets certain revenue levels. Now, that doesn't happen until later in the process. But I think something that has been quite roundly noticed is that the CSRD is not just an EU impacting event. It might be an EU regulation, but it very much has a global impact. And finally, I think something that's worth noting is that that global impact extends beyond the concept of required mandatory reporting. And again, that's something I'm going to return to. So what do companies need to do in order to be ready for something like this? What's the actual impact of this directive? Obviously, I've already talked about audit. That's important because it means that companies need to look at the quality of their data and the way they are collecting that data at the moment. How easy is it for them to justify and verify all the information that is made its way to their external reports? But what information is that? I haven't really talked about that. We've got this concept of sustainability. We're clearly covering all of ES and G. Now, that, in this particular case, very much is what is happening. The European Sustainability Reporting Standards at the moment consist of 12 standards, and some statistics provided with those standards on release also indicate we have 82 disclosures made up of 1,144 data points. Now, that is something to think about, and we're talking about topics that cover the full gamut of environment, social and governance. So water use, own workforce, communities, nature impact, climate, everything you can think of sitting within that ES&G. And there's some really good resources online on our website that will talk you through exactly what's in that. And I think one of the things that has really struck companies looking at this for the first time, and I know that we've recently heard from Baker Hughes, a Workiva customer, about this, is that the scope of these topics and the scope of the requirements for disclosure are really digging into and going across corporate operations in a way that some of the other mandates around the world are not. They're a little bit more focused on that climate piece of the picture. The CSRD is taking its S seriously and is very much about the full gamut of ESG. So companies have a lot of work to do there to look at that. Again, of course, we're talking as well about not just an integrated report, but the idea that this integration should be going back into the company. So there's a lot there for organizations to think about. What is the current state of the topics? What is the current state of the information they're disclosing? Not just can they justify it in an audit, is it verifiable? But also, what is it communicating to the outside world? What is their story? What is their message? What does it look like when they publish their workforce data for the first time? What does it look like maybe when they publish their water usage data for the first time? So there's a lot of review and consideration of what that means. And of course, all of this needs to be surrounded by and embedded within a good description of strategy, of the risks, of the opportunities, and how that affects and impacts the business model. It's a really big and interesting directive. There's a lot of work to do, and that's why we will be covering it again in future. As you can probably tell, I am struggling to fit all the relevant information into the short period of time that I have. Let's finish up with a quick statistic, though. I mentioned earlier that this stretches beyond compliance. Now, why did I mention that when I'm talking about a regulation and a directive? Workiva recently commissioned an independent survey. Our 2023 annual reporting benchmark survey had brought back some very interesting results. Now, the one I want to raise today is that we asked organisations responding to our survey how many of them were going to need to comply with the CSRD. The interesting bit is we asked a follow-up question. If they weren't needing to comply with the CSRD, how many of those organisations were going to be looking at it voluntarily? And we found that 59% of organisations who do not need to comply with the CSRD right now plan to do so to some extent anyway. And that is a really big number. What we're looking at here is organisations looking for something that gives them that guiding set of standards, that information that allows them to understand what investors need. And we're seeing voluntary reporting against a mandated set of standards. Now, it will be interesting to see how that goes in practice, but I think there's a really big takeaway there. This isn't just about a regulation happening. This is not just about a mandate coming down from on high saying suddenly we need sustainability data. This is part of a much bigger market motion towards sustainability, towards the broad information set that investors need to understand the value of a company. And I think that's a really, really key point for our listeners to remember. So if you're interested in diving a bit deeper into the CSRD, stay tuned for some upcoming episodes. We're going to be featuring special guests. In the meantime, we have a wealth of content you can check out on our website, including some past webinars. Thank you very much for joining us for another episode of ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, or sustainability, audit and risk. It's been a pleasure guest hosting my first episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to see future episodes on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Thanks again, and talk soon.